From the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. I'm joined by Tom Rogan. He's a commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Hey, we wanted to talk about something that's a little bit odd because it's not something you talk about in the politics from day to day, but it's obviously something that has sort of one of our more fascinating topics, and that's UFOs. And just in January, obviously, I mean, before we get into the topic of like all the news that's happened within the last month, because of course we were like inundated with, you know, the insurrection, then impeachment, then the inauguration, and now everything's focused on the COVID vaccination rollout. But in the midst of the COVID relief bill, there was obviously some news that came out of that. But before we kind of get into that news, in the discussion about UFO sightings and the documents, for you, you have obviously a pretty strong fascination or interest in UFOs. What is the appeal for you? What's the fascination behind it? And why should anyone care about unidentified flying objects?
Well, I think the first reason is that it's different to dealing with China or Russia or North Korea, the contemporary nation-state actor security challenges. And I think, it's one of those subjects that once you engage with it, you kind of go down the rabbit hole, both by necessity in terms of trying to learn more, but also by a function of the fact that you essentially have, the questions that are raised by it are so compelling or significant, at least prospectively, that the potential for what is going on is, so world-changing, as it were, that it kind of drives you on. And I think, to answer your second question, the reason that people should be interested in it is that there is a technology component to this that is, I think, revolutionary. Mm-hmm. It would revolutionize how we travel, communicate, and get our energy. Matters like pollution, for example. There's also obviously the scientific element in terms of exploration. Is there life elsewhere? Mm-hmm. And I do think, quite obviously, that's a legitimate point that needs to be asked with this. And I think the third point was the security component that some of the, actually a lot of the credible witness sightings and data recordings, as it were, from radar, etc., take place in proximity to sensitive military sites around the world. And, that suggests both, I think, an intelligent purpose guiding towards those sites. Mm-hmm. And we should want to know what that is, because certainly if something can detect nuclear ballistic missile submarines at long range, deep underwater, if the Russians and Chinese figure out how to do that, we've got a big problem.
Right.
Because they can destroy our nuclear forces before we could strike. And so, those are probably the top lines.
Yeah. You obviously mentioned in your answer to the whole aspect about the legitimate question of whether we're alone in the universe. In your view, do you believe that we are alone?
No, not in the sense of I don't know whether some of these things are what they are, right? That whether they're extraterrestrial from another planet or extra dimensional or from a different time or some variation of all those themes, but there's something extra to them. At least the compelling ones that have all the the military eyewitnesses, data recordings, etc. The government is extraordinarily confident, at least the people who work the issue, that it is a true unknown, that it's intelligently controlled machinery with capabilities far in advance of any Earth nation or Elon Musk type corporation.
Right.
And so when you hit that point, then it's the old kind of Sherlock Holmes. Anything that is left must be the truth.
I mean, in your sort of study and research in your own sort of personal as well as professional capacity, because you've written about them for the Examiner, are UFOs the strongest evidence we have to suggest that we aren't alone in the universe?
The potential is there, right? And I would say my basing, my answer just there is based on what the government what the people who work on the issue in government think. Others who've had access to the kind of briefing, especially in the last couple of years, and some of the more tangential elements in terms of material analysis from wreckage, etc. But I don't know, right? I mean, it's not forensic proof, and you should want forensic proof to be able to say that there's something else going on. But I think in terms of asking the question and being challenged to think this is credible, certainly when you have, again, the cumulative factor of over a period of at least since the Second World War, very credible witnesses who have a lot to lose by coming forwards, material analysis that's now sort of coming out, and then radar data, satellite, sonar analysis. When you have all those things on particular incidents, and you can develop patterns and the capabilities displayed in terms of purely just in ability of travel, propulsion methods that are not conventional in any sense, or even, next generation in terms of hypersonics.
Right.
Something's going on. You've got tangible material there to at least delve into, versus, I think, some of the people would say, okay, well, if we look at, microbes on, in water somewhere on the moon or whatever it might be, that is compelling, obviously, as well, but it doesn't necessarily show intelligent life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's one thing that kind of stands out, and we'll talk about it in just a moment. But the propulsion systems that we're kind of going to get into, very fascinating stuff. But there obviously there was a point you brought up earlier about sort of the idea that the technological aspect, the security aspect, sort of the knowledge and based on in space exploration. Do you think that mostly the fascination behind sort of what's out there is mostly just on a knowledge base, or is it mostly for us to sort of attain that type of information and capability to develop that type of technology that may or may not exist out there?
Well, in the government, I think certainly there's a more of an interest in figuring out the technology, because again, the other stuff is, it's too hard. We don't have, I think, an understanding of where these things are from. Who built them, what built them, what the intelligence is that's driving them. But we do know that they're machines. We do know to a high degree of confidence they're intelligently controlled because of how they maneuver, where they appear and disappear, how they interact with, for example, fighter jets that are sent up and different sensors that interact with them. So we have a baseline of intelligent controlled machine that is far in advance of anything we know to exist, either in R&D or in present platform delivery on Earth. So those things drive a need to look at the issue seriously and with credibility. And I think they drive me certainly to want to cover the issue, even though there remains, and in some ways very legitimately, a deep skepticism about the subject in journalism and science. A lot of that is down to people, frankly, not knowing, not having sources, not having engaged with the credible literature, and fundamentally having been distracted by the mixture of mentally ill and and
those
dreamers, people whose brains are on another planet,
right?
And there are a lot of them, unfortunately, and so it's. But yeah, look, the fundamental baseline is one of immense seriousness.
I mean, where do you think the whole concept of like someone wearing a tinfoil hat comes from? It's all about like not being probed by extraterrestrials or aliens.
Right. So. And it is important to I think remain grounded and kind of temper what you say and to what you think you can back up. But I mean, I wouldn't write this stuff and say this stuff if I didn't believe it. Or have a journalistic foundation to say it, especially with how sensitive it is, and the fact that if I'm wrong, right, I'm extremely confident I will be proved right, and that will help my reputation.
Yeah.
If I was wrong, though, I'm become another, mentalist, to borrow the British word, right? So, and people knowing my sense of humor, it's probably, I've already got a bit of a baseline there. But, it's, so, yeah, it's a serious matter, but there is a lot of unserious elements that float around within the bubble of it.
Yeah, well, if you're proven wrong, I'll be the first one to dunk on you on Twitter.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, obviously, because this is something that's kind of with respect to the actual divisions within our U.S. government, particularly focused on the U.S. Navy and how they have an office that focuses specifically on sort of the UFOs and what they call UAPs, the unidentified aerial phenomena. Do you think that maybe Space Force has? I mean, obviously, Space Force is sort of like an entity that was created by President Trump to sort of focus on battle, not like possible skirmishes, possible battles with, say, entities across the world like Russia or China,
Right.
And basically controlling space. Do you think that maybe Space Force will possibly have a more advanced role in sort of taking over our research on, or maybe taking over what the UFO task force within the U.S. Navy has been doing?
I think there are complementary elements, certainly in terms of some of the sensor systems, data analysis, big data analysis, some of the satellite capabilities in terms of detecting missile launches, ballistic missile tracking technology. Some of that can support the portfolio of UAP research, but I think it's unlikely that the Space Force would take the leading role, primarily because a lot of this stuff is happening, within Earth's atmosphere. And it's not necessarily something that is predisposed to space per se.
Yeah.
I think there are legitimate questions as to why that is, and whether some of the stuff that's going on in space is perhaps more concealed in terms of these things not presenting themselves. And I think we have pretty good evidence to suggest at least some of these vehicles, because there are different types, it appears, in terms of shape and to some degree behavior patterns. There's relatively good evidence, I would say, but caveat that relatively against what I've said before,
Right.
Of them being able to conceal themselves, both visually and through sensor platforms. Could that be happening in space? Maybe. I don't know if it is. But no, I think the Navy really has the lead on this through the Office of Naval Intelligence, because it has been happening, at least more recently and more publicly, around the aircraft carriers and the nuclear submarines. Which it's happening there because of the nuclear reactors, is the government believes.
All right. Before we get into that, obviously there was a kind of a big development. So as part of the $2.3 trillion COVID relief bill that was passed by Congress and signed into law by former President Trump in December 2020, the Pentagon has 6 months to release information about its UFO task force. Now, the Black Vault, an online resource for declassified documents headed up by John Greenwald, which was published in January 2021, he published a trove of CIA documents on UAPs, the unidentified aerial phenomena, which, again, is the preferred term used by the government, not UFO. First of all, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to go through any of these documents, but what can you kind of tell us about, broad scale, 10,000-foot look view about these trove of CIA documents? First of all, this comes from the CIA, not the U.S. Navy task force.
Yeah, but especially in the 40s, 50s, there is a reporting interest on the part of, leadership officials at the Pentagon and the intelligence community to have people out in the field report their findings. So, it was taken seriously then. Secondly, it's nothing new, right? What we're seeing with the Navy is something that has been happening in some form, at least since the Second World War, and I would say very likely before that, probably a long way before that, and that there is a connection point between these things' interest and more advanced technology. that the US or another country is developing, they tend to sort of saturate around that for whatever reason, which would be suggestive of them being curious about or interested in whatever we're doing. We're being the military and whatever it is, whether it's a nuclear aircraft carrier, flying, sailing around.
Right. So it's more or less just the fact that they've been studying it for this long. It's sort of like confirmation that the U.S. government at least is aware of this stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I think the reason that we don't have more information is not because, it's a great conspiracy to conceal information. There is some of that. But it's more vested in the fact the government doesn't really know what's going on and hasn't been able to figure out what's going on to a degree. Although it, again, as I said, it is now, it is the people who, work on the issue and know it and don't approach it from a biased perspective, which is a big challenge, do believe that it is something other.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you bring up about the conspiracy to conceal information, because almost always people who are interested in UFOs or UAPs or just the existence of extraterrestrial life or aliens always tend to think that the U.S. government is covering something up. And where do you kind of fall on that? Do you actually think it's I mean, I know you said that the government may not actually just know what's going on, but if there was something that they would cover up, what do you think it would be?
If they had video footage of some of these craft at much closer range, which they do, and photos. If they have data analysis that suggests that they're, traveling hundreds of knots underwater and then going thousands of, miles an hour in the air without fuel or without a
Propulsion.
jet fuel, which they do. And, then it begs the question, well, this is not, we know that we cannot find anything from our best intelligence methods and sources to suggest it's China or Russia or Israel, whatever. What does that leave you with? They don't know. And material analysis would be the final thing. So parts of, vehicles that have crashed. And, I use parts. I'm extremely confident they have material analysis that is associated with UFOs. I don't know whether that comes from an intact vehicle. And I certainly don't buy into the proposition offered by people like Bob Lazar, who suggests, he worked on UFOs at Area 51. I think that's BS.
Yeah.
Personally. But
I'm
maybe
glad.
I'll be wrong.
Yeah, no, all right. So you bring up Area 51, and I actually, this is one of those topics, and I was about to say areas, and pardon the pun, that there was, you remember in 2019, there was a storm Area 51. Yeah. First of all, I mean, I know that's sort of like an internet meme, but there are people out there who legitimately thought about storming Area 51 to try to uncover the government's secrets revolving around, whether it be space exploration, whether it be about UFOs and UAPs or just aliens. I mean, what do you know about what's in Area 51? Is it really just all hype, or is there more to it?
Well, we know quite a lot. I mean, it's where they do the testing for new military platforms, whether that be drones or missiles. Missiles, some of that happens actually elsewhere, but aircraft. And, essentially it's just a testing facility. It is not, a bunker for UFOs, or at least there's no credible evidence to suggest it is. And, it fixates in the mind because of, conspiracies and, people came out, Bob Lazar says I worked there and other people. And, there's interesting sightings of craft around there. But I think, a lot of that can be explained by conventional kind of government research of the kind that sparks curiosity more because it's flying around rather than, if it was in a lab somewhere, it would still be really, interesting, but we can't visualize it from the outside.
Yeah.
So that visual component, the middle of the desert, barren, it plays to imagination and but I don't think there are little green men running around underneath Area 51 Groom Lake. Yeah.
I feel like given how our government runs right now, you would think that keeping a secret like that locked up for that long, uh, would be impossible.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. I think you can compare. Some of this hasn't come out because, again, if people went and recovered, wreckage, the 40s, 50s, I think there was a more appreciable ability with military culture to keep those kind of secrets, especially with the Soviet Union threat. But also because people, someone who collects stuff doesn't know what the hell they're collecting.
Right.
Someone who does the analysis knows it's unconventional, but maybe they don't know more than that. I think very few people have all of the different pools of information, and even then, that's relatively sparse beyond it being something else, which posits the other question, or the rational point that I think would be certainly compelling to policymakers in the 40s, 50s, 60s, though I don't think now, which is that society, how would a quite conservative religious society grapple with these questions? And that has been an issue with, people at the Pentagon, especially in the Air Force, for example, and it still exists.
Right.
Some people, very powerful general officers, civilian appointees, trying to prevent more study of the subject because they believe it offends a
Like their
religious
sensibilities.
faith. Yeah, religious faith, and that is unfortunate, but it has been a real challenge, and it certainly was in the 40s and 50s. What do you say? By the way, American people who going to church every Sunday, let's say 50 or more % of those people, and I certainly would think that as a Christian, that they could grapple with the truth of something potentially else being out there, but what if 50% can't, and how does that affect society and people's roles in it? So all of these philosophical questions are imbued in the government's approach to the subject.
Yeah, that's a very good point you bring up, because it really does. I don't think many people think about, if the truth were revealed about any particular subject, that how would that play within the public? Would it be something that's dismissed almost entirely? I mean, I think within like the last maybe few years, I mean, actually I want to kind of get to this now, because obviously the government's been very tight-lipped about UFOs and UAPs. But in 2020, the Pentagon formally released 3 videos that were previously reported by the New York Times in 2017, dubbed simply the Pentagon UFO videos. I know you've seen these because you've reported on them. But for those who are not familiar, they're visual recordings of cockpit instrumentation displays from U.S. Navy fighter jets based aboard the aircraft carriers of the USS Nimitz and the USS Theodore Roosevelt in 2005.
Yep.
2004
and 15.
2004, 2014, and then 2015. And it shows obviously some strange activity, these UAPs, the unidentified aerial phenomena. First of all, what can you tell us about these videos?
Yeah, well, there's more photos and videos important from other incidents as well, going back to the 80s at least, and essentially it's the pilots from the carrier air wings are flying around doing their training exercises off the east and west coasts on pre-deployment, which is their workups before they go away to the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf. They requalify so that the carrier is ready to operate in a war setting if it needed to. So it's basically training exercises.
Sure.
When they're doing it, they're flying around, and the radar controllers on the surface warfare ships and the cruisers send out, go to this area because we have a radar detection. It's weird, behavior patterns, 80,000 to 20,000. The pilots go there. These things then maneuver either alongside or against them in some cases. 2015, they see what the pilot describes as a sphere within a cube. The Tic Tacs in 2004.
Yeah, the Tic Tac, yeah.
And then, end of 2019, which I wrote about, and really Tim McMillan at the debrief kind of, I would say, broke the story on, is they had a triangle that came out of
like a Dorito chip.
Yeah, why not? Yeah,
I mean, that's why some people have likened it to.
And so you've got these different shape sizes, again near the nuclear reactors, which is the government. That's classified. I don't know, the government classifies that because
they don't want anyone to know where
they don't want to figure out. Yeah, they don't want the Russians and Chinese to realize, which they already do, that these things are detecting nuclear reactors and closing with them with impunity.
Right.
The concern is credible. I think the reaction to it is not credible because it's, so this is a continuing thing. There's other footage, I think, going back, really again to the Second World War that's been classified because they don't know what the hell it is and they don't want to scare people. But really, it's just extraordinary machinery flying around.
Right.
Top line, that's really what we know.
But I mean, like the one thing that stands out, and I think this is what one of the fighter pilots was talking about, is that the propulsion system, the system in which it actually gets from point A to point B, or just simply travels through a particular medium, was unlike anything he's ever seen before, because it was like traveling at how many knots underwater?
Hundreds
of knots underwater, and then it just shoots up vertically without in moving through a medium without any way to sort of propel it in that way.
Yeah, so the 2004, probably talking about David Fravor, who's the squadron commander, very well-regarded pilot, and it's a great PBS documentary that came out with his deployment. It shows just how good a pilot he is, and nothing about UFOs, but he's a serious guy.
Right. Certainly not a tinfoil hat
wearing. And the other pilots are serious. You don't pay people to fly those fighter jets and land on aircraft carriers that sometimes are in dark, stormy waters. What happens if you crash that jet into the con tower? You've got hundreds of dead people. What happens if a pilot goes insane and decides to go and bomb New York? You've got a problem, right?
Yeah,
These
absolutely.
are not silly.
These are people
who've gone through a lot of psychological and physical testing, repeatedly.
Right.
And that's so important to emphasize because it disabuses the notion, I think, in a forensic way, of this being delusion.
Right.
It's
a credible source.
Yeah, you've got to, again, think about, you have an unidentified contact that most of the time maybe it's a civilian aircraft or maybe it's, an enemy drone. You want to make a decision quickly before it gets too close to the carrier in case it sinks the carrier of what it is. So they're trained to observe. But in the 2004 incident, that there was underwater detection from the sonar systems, but I don't know if David Fravor was at least aware of that at the time. I don't think he was, and the other pilots in the squadron who went up. But these things are detected doing under the water, in air, no apparent, the amount of G's that they're pulling. Would, based on our understanding of aerodynamics, physics, rip a body apart. So, and then how do you go hundreds of knots under the water because of the friction? How do you go thousands of miles an hour instantaneously So the capability, it's an unconventional propulsion method,
right?
As a given, I think. I think there's pretty good analysis that the military has done in the last few years as to what that propulsion is.
What did they think? Or what have you heard?
The top line, which I think is probably the most credible, as extraordinary as it sounds, is some kind of way of warping the space-time metric, which sounds ridiculous.
Yeah,
and
like out of a sci-fi movie.
That essentially you are creating an environment around the craft in which you can move in a way that allows you to significantly mitigate the impacts of Earth's gravity or friction around you. Right. But essentially, the best way of looking at it might be if you put, something in a bubble in the water, right, in the bathtub, and if you could put something in the middle of a bubble and it sort of comes up to the surface. That thing in the bubble is not really being impacted by the friction because it's sort of moving through. It's not a great example, but it's a sort of
Is it at all possible, like moving in a vacuum?
Yeah, but right, but it's it's more than that in terms of the energy required to do this stuff, as we understand it, gets into kind of quantum mechanics. And I quite carefully now try and say that's about all I know because I'm not great at physics, and you don't want to get it wrong. But it requires huge amounts of energy, at least as we understand it. So it's compelling, very compelling. But one of the things that drives the analysis of that, for example, which hasn't been something I've sort of tried to work on a bit, or am working on a bit, is the degree to which when our aircraft, ground radar, whatever the sensor platform is, satellite, infrared, pilot, gun camera, sonar, whatever it is, depending on how close you get to, let's say this is the radar site and this is the object. If the object's here, or let's say that the radar on the jet is here or on the ground, and the object's here, you're going to get a different return as to the vehicle, its identifying characteristics, versus if you're here, even taking into account distance, right? That it sort of almost changes. And a reason that could be the case is because there's a distortion around the object, right? There's a distortion field that is affecting time, the movement of, data returns coming in and out of this environment. So again, that hence me saying let's leave the physics there.
Yeah.
but you've got data returns that does not compute with what you would see MiG and F-15.
Yeah.
MiG and
F-15.
It's simply different.
Simply like the Doppler effect, where you can tell obviously what type of vehicle it could possibly be based on the time that passes and the velocity that it travels at.
Excellent.
In this case, it just doesn't make any physical sense.
Unless you sort of get into unconventional,
exactly,
or that you just put in the pocket of don't know,
right?
Which is tempting, but I think if you're trying to analyze how these things work to replicate it for your own capabilities, or at least defend against it feasibly, again, not because we think Independence Day is about to happen, but because China or Russia might figure it out first.
Yeah.
Then you do have to try and kind of think about it.
And if we were to take any lesson from our military, is to understand that they will simply never say they don't know anything. They'll simply try to find the answer to everything.
Right, and that goes back to the government point. No one wants to be the president who says, I don't know what the hell's going on here.
Yeah.
And even Trump didn't want to do that. There was an idea that he was going to declassify some stuff.
Right.
Certainly in terms of the material analysis, but that didn't happen. And I think it's, there are reasons. There are good reasons.
And as much as people like to sort of admonish Trump for not knowing anything, particularly his critics, it's always funny to think about. He probably knew more than anyone about the UFOs.
Well, if he chose to be interested enough, right? He did do an interview with George Stephanopoulos, I think, a couple of years ago, and Stephanopoulos, to his credit, asked about it, and he said, "Well, I don't think it's UFOs, but it's interesting." With the former president, I think his interest perspective was a key driver as to how engaged he was with perhaps the information.
Yeah.
But,
he could be just playing the poker face right there, just being like, I don't know much, but he knows everything. Right. And maybe because he's obviously very good in terms of marketing himself, and sort of, as much as people like to criticize his messaging, he's very good at messaging.
Right.
And I think he probably would understand above all that maybe the people just aren't ready for it.
Right. And that he doesn't want to lean into a subject where there's a lot more that he doesn't know than he does know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure he knows his limitations, but I think it'd be interesting it would be interesting if the last act he had before leaving office was to declassify all the UFO documents. That would have been pretty legendary. But kind of getting back to these UFO videos from the Pentagon. Obviously, we talk about sort of like the manipulation of the field, like all these different characteristics about these specific vessels. Is there anything in your mind in particular with respect to these videos that gives you any sense that, these are extraterrestrial or alien, or is it just something completely different that we just have no knowledge of?
Well, I think the technology baseline is obviously the main point, and the curiosity about nuclear sites really going back to, uranium mines in Africa.
Now, are they almost always around nuclear sites that we find these things? Or is it just because we have heavy military presence
That's
around
part of it. That's part of it, right? We have detection platforms or counter detection platforms, but it's not always there. It's conventional. Advanced. They appear near more kind of conventional. New aircraft that we're developing. They appear. Well, based on around the world. Just about anywhere. But of course, those witnesses are civilians, and there's not, data recording, so you have to judge it more skeptically.
Yeah.
But I don't know, if you look at, there was an incident in Socorro, New Mexico in the 60s with a police officer who essentially drove up on, some kind of version of a Tic Tac, it appears, and said he saw people outside of it. Briefly, the FBI investigated that, found it very credible. It was a very serious, there was a very
just like landed on the ground.
Just in the middle of the desert on the ground. He thought it was a rolled over car.
Wow.
There was and then the next day, the day after, a rancher saw the same thing.
Wow.
Reported both FBI kind of case files. The FBI has still a lot of stuff that hasn't been declassified in terms of near civilian nuclear sites.
Mm-hmm.
But which they investigate, right? Because someone sees it, maybe it's Al Qaeda flying a drone around. There's a reason for them to investigate beyond finding aliens. But I think there's a school sighting in Zimbabwe. There have been a few. Melbourne, Australia, the 60s.
Chicago O'Hare in 2006.
That was at the airport. But there is, I think, more to this than just
drones,
things jumping
balloons,
in and out of existence. There seems to be, at least in some of these cases, an intelligent purpose. I mean, the triangle things, for example. There's a guy, David Marler, who's written a great book on who's a very serious guy. That's one of the things that's really interesting with this subject, and I think needs to be said, is that there are a lot of serious people who've written about it. Robert Hastings, who broke the nuclear connection, David Marler on black triangles, who are really serious people. These are not.
These aren't loonies.
These aren't loonies,
like
and they've been treated as loonies for a long time, which is, I think, one of the nice things as this generates more public attention. It's going to keep happening.
They
as much as
get
the government kind of wants to
get
put it back.
vindicated.
They're going to get vindicated.
Yeah.
But the triangles moving very slowly over population centres. And then zipping, at Belgium in the 1990s. Your listeners, viewers can go on YouTube and type in Belgium triangles sightings. You have the head of the Belgian Air Force or a senior Belgian Air Force officer saying, we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
U.S. military saying, well, it's not us. So there's stuff going on. There's there are sort of other factors on the periphery of it that are perhaps harder to give an evidentiary baseline that suggest sort of other things in that, in answer to your question. But I think you don't want to jump too far into that, because then you do get into, you make the subject less credible, because it's not something you can support in an argument with.
Speculation is very. You walk a tightrope when it comes to speculation, because as soon as you sort of go off onto one side, then obviously you kind of lend credence to the idea that maybe you are
right. But I have no doubt that some of these, 99.9% of UFOs are a cloud or a plane or a drone or a guy in a jetpack over it.
Oh yeah, well now we can't rule that out, because now obviously our technology has advanced. But I'm talking about
0.1%. I am extremely confident, to the point of journalistic credibility, whatever, that it's something truly other.
Yeah.
And so is the vast majority of people, which is a relatively small group in the government, who work the issue or have worked it.
Finally, when it comes to sort of this document release, even if the government doesn't deliver the goods on whatever they release about their UFO task force within the U.S. Navy, for the believers out there, is there any reason to hope that anything substantive will come to light?
Yes, and they won't release. I don't think anything really significant is going to come out of that report.
I mean, that's what I think too.
There'll be a classified annex to it that is most of the information and kind of reporting, but most of that won't be terribly
We won't see anything earth-shattering.
No.
Yeah.
They're just going to say we're working it. We don't really know what it is. But yeah, stuff is going to keep coming out because one of the things that's interesting is the pilots, people who've seen it in the military and been told never talk about it, otherwise you're going to lose your,
Your rank,
flight quals, or whatever. They're angry, so they're talking now. People coming out of the woodwork, and the intelligence community, for people who work on other issues, a lot of this stuff, because it doesn't have some of the data analysis and how good we are at tracking X size object at X range, because it just has a photo or an image that's of something unidentified, that it isn't as highly classified as some of the other stuff. And people have been sharing it very widely across their kind of intranet at works. That stuff will leak it at certain points, and it's going to keep happening, because analysts who have access to the information, I think, come to the obvious conclusion this is something kind of cool and potentially, earth-shattering.
Yeah. Well, Tom Rogan, commentary writer for the Washington Examiner, good friend. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Siraj.